Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar, How to Make Data Safe and Network Sound for Schools. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am editor-at-large for eSchool News, and I'm happy you are joining us today for what I know will be a very insightful and important conversation. Today's event is brought to you by Microsoft. Microsoft is the leading platform and productivity company for the mobile-first, cloud-first world, and its mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. In education is to empower every student. Microsoft believes there is limitless potential within every student, every educator, and every school. Together, we can all unlock this potential by providing technology that empowers educators and inspires students. Before we go to our conversation today, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the features of the platform that we're using for this webinar. Today's event will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within the next few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. You can submit questions at any time during this presentation by clicking on the Q&A box. There will be a time at the end of the presentation for our speakers to address those questions, although I may throw them at the panelists a little bit before, just to kind of keep things interesting. So please feel free to submit any ideas or thoughts as the conversation goes forward. There's also a chat function you can launch. Feel free to use this feature to contact someone from the eSchool News team if you have a technical question. So with those housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started and just do a quick introduction of our two panelists. First, Doug Levin. Doug is the National Director at the K-12 Security Information Exchange. Doug has been engaged in education and technology policy issues for over 2 decades in a variety of roles, most prominently in helping to develop and implement the nation's first education technology plan and strategy last century, back in 1996, under President Clinton, as well as the subsequent updates in 2000 and again in 2004 under President Bush, as well as 2016 under President Obama. Sorry to date you like that, Doug, but that's a great history there. From 2009 to 2015, he served as Executive Director of the State Educational Technology Directors Association. Previously, Doug has also held positions with the American Institutes for Research, the National Cable and Telecommunications Association, and the National Association of State Boards of Education. Also with us today, Mike Tregerboff. Mike is the Director of Network Operations at the Peoria Unified School District. Mike has been involved in K-12 education for 25 years in the capacity of teacher, engineer, and director. In his current role as Director for Network Operations, he oversees the network infrastructure for a school district of 36,000 students. He uses his experience as a teacher and network director to manage the district network and to look for opportunities where district technology can help further the education of the students in his district. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you.
I think maybe we could get started, Doug. Talk a little bit more about your association and more importantly, maybe not more importantly, but what is the current state of play as you see it in education technology? We've spoken several times since the pandemic has begun, of course, over Zoom and not in person, unfortunately, but your work has been essential in terms of kind of keeping pace of what's happening in this place. So the pandemic, in a weird way, seems to have maybe accelerated some of the problems that were a number one problem even before going into this. I'll let you get us started.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kevin. Thanks for hosting this webinar today. And that introduction, of course, it makes me think about the picture that the headshot that I gave you, and I realized I probably need to update that. I'm looking a little bit young in that picture, because indeed I've been around since we've been connecting schools to the information superhighway. So the organization that I'm with, as you said, I'm National Director of the K-12 Security Information Exchange, or K-12-6. We are a nonprofit dedicated solely to helping K-12 organizations, school districts, charters, private schools, regional and state education agencies protect themselves from emerging cybersecurity risks. We're the only organization, nonprofit, independent organization dedicated to that mission. And we launched actually just late last year, right? So we're a relatively young organization in that regard. With respect to, the sort of the reason that we launched, and it's really comes down to the fact that, schools rely on technology more now than they ever have in the past. I think we've been really focused on that use in the classroom, sort of instructional technology, educational technology, use by teachers, use by students. But we shouldn't forget that school districts are large enterprises and that technology is used for point of sale and cafeterias. It's used to route buses and transportation services. Of course, all the employee HR management is done online. We have student information systems. Even the physical security systems of our schools are managed digitally. And so really, schools have undergone a digital transformation. And as such, they are at increased risk to all of the cyber threats that exist for all types of organizations. And I think, one of the things that has people scratching their head is, well, why specifically are schools at risk? Like, what is it that is that makes it special? After all, why are people interested in students' grades? Schools don't have very much money. We're not financial institutions. We're not hospitals. Is the data that valuable? And the fact of the matter is that we've seen over time that criminal threat actors have not only been sort of sweeping up schools in sort of these mass phishing campaigns or mass campaigns just to scan the internet for vulnerable devices, but that they're increasingly being specifically targeted, meaning the threat actors are doing research on school districts, largely because school districts have money. And again, I think that is, or they have data that is valuable. And so in some respects, it's important to know that, of course, school districts don't have enough money to do everything they want to do for their students, but they are large enterprises. As I said, facilities, transportation, food service, largest employer in many communities. They don't have enough money to do everything they would like to do, but even a medium-sized school district in the country might have an annual budget of $100 million or more, right? That's plenty of money from a perspective of a threat actor. But then in terms of data, they're absolutely interested in the personal information that schools hold. That includes employee data, but particularly student data, the data on minors. That's particularly valuable to them because on the dark web, those who are interested in identity theft are much more interested in the personally identifiable information of minors who have not yet established credit records, because they can abuse those records for years and years before they are caught. Kevin, if you or I had our identity stolen, probably our credit card company would contact us and say, hey, this looks like a weird charge. And we shut it down relatively quickly. That's not to say there aren't big hassles involved and real money at stake, but it can be years and years before students' identities can be reclaimed and the damage that's been done unwound. So, the short answer is that schools are relying on technology. Threat actors know that, and they can make money off of exploiting schools.
Yeah. So, Mike, you have a long, distinguished career as well. When you started to get in and work on school networks and start to put these things together, did you ever think that foreign threats from Belarus and student identification records being stolen was going to be at the top of your worry list?
Probably not until the last few years. And I think Doug actually had echoed it pretty well. I mean, we've actually thought about that from the standpoint that having a student like a 13 or 14-year-old's identity information is something they can readily leverage for a long period of time, because that age of a person is not going out and checking their credit. They're not checking bank accounts. They're not doing any of that. And so having an identity like that really is dormant to the actual owner of the identity until they become of age, then they find that all of this stuff has been done under their name. And it can be used and leveraged for a longer period of time, where if they were to steal my identity or do something that affects my credit, I'm probably more likely to find it in a very short period of time and mitigate that issue. And so that's one of the big things I think that's wrapped around student identity, maybe the biggest one when it comes to student identity. And within a school district too, of our size, we employ several thousand people. So, and the short-term attack too is beneficial because they do, if they were able to get into our system, to get bank account information, social security numbers from our staff, and those types of things. So, we have that wide range of identity when it comes to that, minors as well as our staff, that we need to try to protect. And so it's obviously at the top of our list in terms of what we can do within the budgets that we do have. And Doug had actually mentioned that. I mean, if you do have a school district that has $100-200 million, well, you've got everybody else fighting for that money as well. Everything, obviously, to educate our students is the first and foremost reason to have it. But between facilities and food services and all the other departments, that has to be divvied up. And so you have to decide where's your priorities at. And then we actually are part of that as well, obviously. And where do we need to put our money at and prioritize things? And probably security is getting the most conversation now within our organization about what security pieces do we need to have in place, and we can afford to have in place, and we'll get the most bang for the buck, so to speak.
Now, when we talk about things now, unfortunately, everything is still within the context of COVID and the pandemic. Mike, talk a little bit about, I'm assuming that cybersecurity was at the top of the list, BP, before the pandemic. When your district, I don't know, you can maybe talk a little bit about your shift to remote learning at the very beginning, or the hybrid learning. How have those new models affected cybersecurity? Has it made it more difficult? Is it the same? Has it given it a heightened interest? Give us a little bit of where you are when it comes to district security in the age of COVID.
I would sit there and say that we're building the airplane while it's flying all the time. We had to do something very quickly and fast to handle that. From the Microsoft perspective, obviously we are leaning a lot on what the technologies already is inside of the technology that we purchased from some of the organizations, Microsoft being a big one, and leveraging that and making sure we're as secure as we possibly can in terms of how we're restricting access and how we're allowing access back into our environments. And that's happening all the time. We're having discussions all the time. I'll say this, I'm trying to be a little vague because I don't like to share exactly what we're doing, in a public setting, but we're constantly shoring up, our authentication methods, allowing into various parts of our network where it's restricted, and restricting all of it as much as we possibly can, and forcing authentication in everywhere we can. I think another thing too is the culture shift you deal with your organization, because one of the things we've always said is 100% security, 0% use. So if we can, that's where we're at. I mean, if we could do that, that's where we're at. But we got to find that balance of, there's always some risk. So where is it we're going to allow the use and not cause a lot of cumbersome issues? Or how can we make this efficient? How can we make this as seamless as possible for the user? And also maintain the security posture that we want within our organization. And so that's always a balancing act. And we're doing that right now. Every day I've had several meetings about stuff that we're doing right now for different types of authentication that we've got going on within the organization. And I have to get our executive level branch to understand the importance and the priority of that. So we're not reactionary to a major breach, And so I hope that answers the question without, kind of being vague a little bit on purpose.
No, absolutely. I know, having covered education technology for a long time, I always loved it because educators are always willing to share their best practices, when it comes to curriculum or instructional strategies and things like that. But this topic is always one where all of a sudden everyone, you get crickets, right? Because you don't want to put your defenses, or also,
something I would say, and probably one of our most major issues, and Doug had alluded to this too, is the phishing campaigns are rampant. And, more than, and I'd say this is just my take on it, and even to talk with some of my colleagues, I think training should be at the top of the list for taking care of the phishing issues, because I can run a phishing campaign and determine, hey, I had so many users that were vulnerable to this campaign at this point. But ultimately, if they're trained well enough I think that does more to prevent it than having a campaign. I mean, I think campaigns should be done, but I don't think as much as that others may think. I think if we have a rigorous training environment that is repeated through the school year, that's going to accomplish more to prevent that type of a breach or us getting breached through a user's mistake or issue. And that should get a lot more attention from a training perspective. And I find it, I'll say this, we find it hard sometimes to get in front of our staff because everybody's buying for their available time. And whether it be professional development for curriculum or those types of things are in front of kids all day long. And so it's really making it a priority and giving it attention is something we do, but it's hard sometimes because you got other parts of our organization that really are trying to get their time in needed as well.
Yeah, there really are two sides of the coin, right, Doug? When you talk about the algorithms and the software and the hardcore technologies to protect the firewalls for the servers, and then there's human behavior. Right. And as Mike mentioned, the phishing, I was going to ask, of all the various threats, it seems that the human behaviors maybe are the leading cause of maybe some of the most trouble. Does that resonate with what you see, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly ultimately all issues, even those that are caused, by technical issues are root decisions made by people, right? And actions being carried out by people. It's important to know that there's somebody else sitting at a keyboard, at the other end, right? And ultimately, you're sitting in the school district and you're responsible for trying to protect it. We think about it as three legs. I mean, there's the absolutely technical components, and this is the primary role of the IT department and IT team. Broadly speaking, though, it is about culture, right? And so you do need to involve everyone who has a stake in the issue, all of your, users, anybody who's got access to sensitive systems, right? And that includes students as well. So students shouldn't have access, that sort of access, same sort of access as staff and administrators. But nonetheless, schools have long battled with, frankly, tech-savvy, bored students, really starting in middle school, if not like upper elementary now, right? Who, when they get bored, they turn their attention to the school district network and tools. The third leg of that, and it is related to people though, is around policies, right? Because at the end of the day, and Mike mentioned this, it's about risk management and making risk management decisions. And, IT can advise about that and they can implement that, but ultimately, you're going to need folks in leadership roles, the superintendent or the school board, to make the decision about what risk you're willing to accept, what risk you're going to try to mitigate through controls, even if it does inconvenience some people, like maybe they have to take a second step to log in. But we're not willing to take this risk because we know that there are threat actors knocking on the door every day, right? We're getting those phishing emails. And, sometimes maybe they're targeted. In other cases, it's these, the principal, somebody's spoofing the principal and saying, go buy me a gift card. I need it right away. I'll tell you just a personal anecdote. My daughter is a teacher, a new teacher this year. She texted me at one point saying, the head of her school said, can I get a gift card? Is it okay if I ask if I can buy that on the school credit card and not my own? And I'm like, stop. Right. That is, that exact scam happens all the time to school districts all over the country. Stop right where you are. So, three legs, training the people, practices, the policy, and the technology.
Yeah, I'll just verify that for Doug. We deal with that particular scam on a regular basis. And I can sit there, I think I can share this. We've had several staff members fall victim to it and have lost. And it's not a loss to the school district in this type of scam. It's generally their own personal funds, because I like to say this about teachers. They're one of the most giving people in this entire world. And when something happens, and if they get an email that looks for from anybody, and especially the principal, hey, I need this help. Can you get this for me and do it? You've got that mentality out there where I'll go out and get this and take care of it for them. And they're just not educated well enough to realize they're getting scammed. And they go out and do it. And we've had a few staff members that have actually lost money to that specific scam. There's various nuances to it, but it's that same thing of buying gift cards and those types of things. and so that's really who it is. It's actually affected this person personally. It hasn't really affected the organization, but it has, because it's one of our staff members that tragically got, taken in by the scam at that point. But it's a very common one, that one for sure.
And what is the, so what do you do to combat that? I mean, is it an awareness campaign? I mean, the phrase that comes to my mind is don't copy that floppy, right? Back again, last century,
Right.
maybe.
I think that hinges back to good, authentic training wrapped around these types of things, so that when our teachers are reading the email, they have enough of an education and knowledge about what phishing is all about, that they can spot that, because we have policies in place, we have procedures in place. They send this stuff to abuse and we examine it. We always tell them to be safe than sorry. And, but I'll tell you, it's like, I think the more training we can do, the better. And there's just not enough time to provide that training, or I wish it was, we do the training, but if I had my way, I'd say we should have it more, and we should have more different, more types of it in terms of the variations of the different things that come in. Obviously they try to imperse people like the superintendent all the time. Usually those don't work as well, because they're like, this is odd. The superintendent doesn't ever send anything out like this. And it's some of the stuff that's getting pretty, they're getting pretty good at it, and the grammatical errors are gone. It looks authentic. It's they articulate a lot better in the emails these days, and they just got to be careful with it, and so I would say it's something we deal with. That's one of the things we deal with on a more regular basis, unfortunately, than some of the other things. So I always say it's easier to fool a human than it is the firewall, if we've got it set up correctly, so.
Yeah, if I can, Kevin, I just want to jump in. I think, so I agree completely that we're not spending near enough attention on sort of raising the cyber hygiene practices of the school community members, all told. In fact, I was just looking at research, showing it the data breach incidents for even very, very young kids, primarily for personal use, right? For things they're doing outside of school, gaming, social media, and things like that, which they probably shouldn't be on due to COPPA, but they are. We all know they are on their personal devices. But the counterpoint to that, I think, is that unfortunately for many of our environments, all we need is one person to fall for, and as Mike said, increasingly sophisticated scams.
Yeah.
Right. And if it just takes one person to, click that link, to open that attachment, it's very difficult to get to a place where you're going to train away that problem where, 100% of the people are going to be right 100% of the time. Particularly for larger organizations, I think at some point something's going to go wrong. And I think this is where I think shifting about cybersecurity is I think thinking about cybersecurity is starting to shift. And I think COVID helped push this as well, right? Because I think the old model was thinking of the school district network like, the castle walls with the moat around it, and anything that was inside was good. We knew it was fine and we could trust it, and everything on the outside was bad, and we're just going to keep it out. We'll have that strong firewall. We'll have these, anti-malware, anti-spam filters, and we just get better ones. We'll be in good shape. I think what happened with COVID is people who weren't one-to-one went one-to-one. The one-to-one is not just on-prem, but off-prem. People are on home networks. More and more of our applications and tools are not on servers maintained by the district in their perimeter, but they're up in the cloud being managed by third parties or fourth or fifth parties, right? And that's a whole different kind of architecture to try and protect, right? And we've long struggled, I think, with sort of bored students, as I mentioned, but also teachers who make mistakes, post information on a public website, email stuff out that shouldn't have gone to the whole school distribution list, just to some people. Maybe somebody who's supporting the school board doesn't redact enough the right information, right, and it gets sent out and it's breached, right? We've dealt with stuff like that, but I think we've got, as I think Mike suggested, increasingly sophisticated threat actors on the outside who are working to scam us or to drop some malware, right, like ransomware on our systems and take advantage of us. And it's that sort of mindset about how do you protect the environment when, you don't have complete control over it, is newer and much more challenging for schools. And I think, like Mike said, the response to COVID, it's amazing what school districts did to respond kind of on a dime to keep learning going. But I think there is no question that, some things had to get loosened up to allow that to happen. As Mike said, you can't do 100% security. People can't do their jobs. So we had to loosen some stuff up. I think, hopefully people are starting to tighten stuff back up as people come back to school. But we still have hybrid, going on for some students. Most of us do. It's definitely an evolving challenge. And as Mike suggested too, staffing, for these, IT staffing in general is slim in school districts around the country. But when you talk about staffing with security expertise, super slim. I mean, it's definitely a minority of school districts that have dedicated security-minded IT staff. And it's just a really, it's a tough lift. It's a tough lift for folks.
Well, it's interesting, both of your responses talk a little bit about mindset and the changing mindset of what cybersecurity is. And, Mike, you talked about, all it takes is one person and almost the expectation that it's going to happen. That, like, maybe in the past we talked about, it's like how we can protect ourselves completely against these cybersecurity threats. And it sounds to me more and more like you're talking about, like, what's going to happen when the inevitable happens and how to deal with the inevitable when it goes on. And that's a little bit about the Microsoft have the zero trust strategies that they came out in a recent white paper. Mike, maybe you can talk a little bit about, and you also mentioned before, it's about having a sliding scale between creating obstacles for students versus having access to things. Talk a little bit about how you see those mindsets being changed.
It's, it's hoping that they don't become decisions that are made as a reaction to something that's bad happening. Trying to convince our executives that this should be in place as a proactive measure to limit access to various environments or require additional authentication. Things that I have control over is network, obviously. So I can do things to the network that they don't know about, and it doesn't affect them really, but it does shore up our security in terms of access and in terms of even segmentation and restricted areas within our network and those types of things. And I can do that in the background a lot without really having to involve our executives, other than telling them I'm doing this. It's not going to do anything, to you guys at this point. And I know Doug had talked about culture, and that's it. It's a culture shift, realizing how important it is. And I think sometimes that culture shift is effective when you show them this helps you personally as well, not just from your professional lives, but it helps you personally as well. But it's shifting their thinking before all this happens. And I think it's not funny. It's kind of tragic, but it is funny. When we see neighboring school districts get breached in some way, then it lights up the conversation. And usually I have a little more success at those times, and that's sad, but and I shouldn't say it's sad, but it's something that I get. It really brings it alive to their minds again, because they're thinking about so many other things within our district that are important to our students and our kids. And I always liken IT, we're kind of like electricity. It just comes on, it works, but there's so much to keeping it working correctly and without problems. And obviously protecting the information we have is one of the most important things that we can provide to our staff and our students. I'll say this, fortunately, I have an executive staff that listens and understands that. There's times where it becomes a little more cumbersome, but they adjust and understand why we are doing that. So I feel blessed, I should say, to have the executive people that I have to answer to. But it also is something that I have to really explain to them. Why do we have to do this? It's going to cause this more of an issue, or a little bit more cumbersome to do that. But they're very attentive and are open-minded to why we have to do those things. So that's always a good thing. And I know that's not always the case in every organization. So I'm blessed in that way.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So a question from the audience coming in, which I think is appropriate. Where can a small school or district get the training they need to keep their systems safe? So I guess when it comes to training and some of these other things, Peoria with 36,000 students is a pretty significantly sized district. Doug, maybe you can talk. I mean, are there different solutions for different size districts?
So not that I have seen per se, right? I think there's a number of training resources that are available. Well, so I guess I should caveat this. So if you're talking about sort of general awareness training for the school community, teachers, staff, non-IT administrators, there's actually quite a bit on the market that is available, probably some free stuff as well. Now, is it particularly well targeted to K-12? Probably most of it is not. It's probably general practices for people in all types of organizations. It may or may not be super engaging, right? I mean, that's stuff that folks will have to vet and see. I'm curious, if Mike has a solution, like who he's liked and what he has seen in that regard. If you're talking about IT staff and helping IT staff get the support they need to sort of up-level their security knowledge, I mean, so, obviously there are a number of IT security certifications that are available for people to go through. Ideally, a school district would be footing the bill for that certification cost because they're going to benefit, because it's quite a bit of work to get those sorts of certifications. And folks like SANS Institute run some, pretty great courses to help people come up to speed on that. I will say at the K-12 Security Information Exchange at K-12-6, we are really focused on trying to help those school districts that are smaller and much less mature in their sort of cybersecurity risk management practices, and help them sort of take manageable steps to protect themselves. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer to think that we're going to be keeping our systems safe, because I think there's really no such thing as 100% security. Just like for physical safety and worried about the physical well-being of kids on campus, we take steps to protect them, locks on the doors, maybe security resource officers, we have drills, we have plans, we practice them. There's a budget, there's somebody in charge. We need to take that same sort of approach for cybersecurity, for digital risks, and need to take it just as seriously. And it's something that should involve everybody in the school community, not just the IT team. Because I think too often, if it plugs in, you go to the IT team and they take care of it. And that security, that's something that they're taking care of, obviously, and it doesn't involve me and my job. But I think that's leading to some of the challenges that we're having, because in fact, it is everyone's job. And so, but that is, in our work, we're probably spending as much time talking about the technical things that schools can do to protect themselves. Mike was talking about, changes to the network settings that maybe people won't notice. There's absolutely things that can be done at that level. But a lot of it then is, talking about authentication issues. One of the challenges that's keeping a lot of people up at night in K-12 settings is getting folks transition to multi-factor authentication. So much more secure way for people to log in than traditional password approaches. But that's mostly a conversation actually about change management in a school district, right? And because there are tools that, frankly, are pretty straightforward to implement. I'm not saying perfect, not saying it's free. It depends a lot on your setup, but absolutely manageable from a technical side. It's the change management piece where I think people have gotten tripped up, and where they've even rolled stuff out and had to have it rolled back because the implementation went so poorly the first time. And so that is as much a challenge, I think, particularly for small and medium-sized shops, as the technical challenges.
Yeah. Once again, going back to kind of the human behavior versus the pure technology challenges that we're talking about here. Mike, did what Doug just say resonate with you in terms of?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's all on. I'll say from a practical sense, I guess the colleagues around my area, I think one of the things our smaller school districts do more than I probably do, even though I do some too, is they hire a consultant or managed service provider of some kind to help with the security piece. Because like you said, finding security personnel is really hard to do, especially, I'll say it this way, usually what the wages are for a school district compared to private industry in those seats. And so tends to be a place that all of us probably use at a certain level. I think our smaller organizations in our state, I think they leverage them more heavily than some of the larger organizations because of their funding and where they're at. And so they'll get MSPs to do a lot of that work for them.
Yeah, and depending on what state you're in, your educational service center or ISD or ESC, your regional education agency might provide those services as well, particularly for the smaller districts.
Yeah. Speaking about money and budgets, the news from this past week and from the past several months is that there seems to be a good amount of money that's going to be offered for schools for education technology in general. But Doug, I know that you've said earlier in the summer, talked about some specific provisions that are going to be coming out specifically targeted towards cybersecurity. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so what I would say is the slow wheels of the federal government are turning, and they are now paying attention to issues of K-12 cybersecurity. That's good news, but I don't think it's we're going to see immediate help. So in October, the beginning of October, the president signed the K-12 Cybersecurity Act. This is the first ever K-12 specific cybersecurity bill Congress has ever passed, which is really pretty significant. Now, on the downside, it's just essentially commissioning a study from CISA, the Federal Cybersecurity Agency, to provide recommendations on ways the K-12 sector could shore up its cybersecurity controls and maybe what help they need. But frankly, getting recommendations from CISA on the next steps that can be taken could be super valuable. We're already in conversations with them about that. They are absolutely committed to try to meet the deadlines that Congress set for them, which means we could see this report early next year, right? And hopefully that sets the stage then for some future work from Congress. A couple of other things of note at the federal level. Actually, as part of the infrastructure bill that was just passed, there is a component of that, as I think we're all learning, there's lots of components to it, but the State and Local Cybersecurity Improvement Act was part of what was passed there. And that will provide $1 billion over 4 years to states and local governments of all types to shore up their cybersecurity practices. Now, states have to write plans and states have to make determinations about what their priorities are. And, school districts will be competing with the election systems and police and public health and public universities and all of the other public utilities, everything else. So I would certainly encourage folks in the audience to reach out to their state level leadership and express the needs of the K-12 sector with respect to cybersecurity and make sure some of that money flows to the direction of the K-12 sector. And then, there's ongoing considerations at the FCC as well to make some of the E-rate funding available for cybersecurity purchases. Now, one of the challenges, of course, at the FCC, it's a partisan commission, and the Democrats, now being in the White House, get to appoint a majority of commissioners to the FCC. My understanding is that actually Commissioner Rosenworcel is being reconfirmed today by the Senate. But the fifth nominee, the third Democrat, Gigi Sohn, who the education community should, in my opinion, should be very excited about as coming on. Her nomination looks likely to be a little bit more challenging in the Senate. And so, as long as the FCC remains deadlocked 2-2, the prospects of getting, a big shift in how E-rate operates is diminished.
Yeah.
So we'll keep an eye on that as well. But nonetheless, things are happening. People are paying attention. These are just the first actions, but I think we're going to expect more. We should expect some more out of the U.S. Department of Education, which is at a very, very light time here. More from CISA, the cybersecurity work, and maybe more resources as well. Just not immediately.
Yeah. Mike, what would be on your wish list if these funds were to find their way to your district?
There's several things that we would want to buy. If you think of some of the things from a complexity standpoint, from infrastructure wise, there's always better security hardware and software we'd like to purchase that a school district can't afford. Again, I'm being purposely vague, but it's always one of those things. I do have my senior engineer who's in charge of security. He's always on top of it. Mike, we should get this, we should get that. And I'm like, yes, I know. But fundings are finite and they have to support our kids, and we all know that. And so we have to put, again, it kind of goes back to that original part. We got to put our bang for a buck where it's going to matter the most. And Doug had kind of said this earlier, it's like we do train. I guess I probably had harped on the training things. It's because it's a low cost solution. It's a time thing, but it's a low cost part of it because it just requires our time to put into it. But there's also lots of hardware and software solutions that should be considered because it can help mitigate that before it ever gets there, whether it be like security gateways and firewalls and next generation firewalls and things like that. And, internal firewall structures now within your network that are watching traffic, segmenting it through the different, segmentations across your network and monitoring it and having those solutions that watch for anomalies in your traffic. And all of that's money, and education's not given anything really for that. And so they have to create their own budgets for them. Their budgets are given to educate the kids. I think the security stuff that's out there now, it's necessary, and we do find ways to get it, but it's a lot more difficult if we didn't have that funding. If the feds would give us more of that funding, we could invest into that a lot easier than what we're having to do now. It's very challenging, but we do find ways to get to it. I don't know how other states perform, but there's all kinds of funding mechanisms through bonds and overrides, and you hope that your communities will support you in some of those things, but that's at their pleasure, and some of those things help though when you get them.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, it's like electricity, right? I mean, this is, as far as budget items go, these aren't nice to haves. These are utilities. They're essential.
Right. But they don't see everything behind it that makes it work efficiently and smoothly, as electricity companies. Nobody knows the complexities of what it does to deliver that to your house, so, yeah.
Well, I think Mike, had earlier said that, it's sometimes you can leverage the fact that, your neighbors, your peers may have experienced an issue in other districts near to you. And I think in our data, it's been very clear that there isn't a kind of school district that is immune from these risks, right? We've seen the largest school districts to the smallest school districts, from Alaska to Florida, Maine to Hawaii, and all 50 states hit, by these sorts of these sorts of issues. And, ultimately, you're paying for cybersecurity sooner or later, right? You can try to be proactive and spend what money you have available and make the best decisions you can make. Hopefully that, if you're making the right decisions, you will reduce your risk profile, right? Reduce the odds that you're going to experience a risk, experience a threat. But, you can't get to 100%. But, if you do experience an incident, you've got all that sort of recovery and response and rebuilding expense that has to happen. And it really behooves school districts to try to sort of think through that process up front and be proactive about it and not be reactive. Because I've seen, it's the school districts that thought it would never happen to them, didn't have a plan in place for how to respond, maybe have been, always, trying to do what they can with security, but it was always in the back burner. Yeah. Right. And if they experience an incident, we've seen recent reports of school districts, including like Buffalo and Baltimore County, they are anticipating $8 to $10 million a piece in remediation costs from the ransomware incidents they've experienced. And that's unbudgeted cost just to get back to where they felt like they needed to be. Right. So, from a perspective of a school leader, you're paying for these, to mitigate these risks one way or another. Yeah. Right. You're either doing it before the roof collapses or after the roof collapses.
Something that I think it got added to that is getting cyber insurance is far more difficult now without having the proper security measures in place. And that's really escalated over the last year. In order to get cyber insurance, they'll just turn you down if you don't have certain things in place on your network.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think, on the policy side, whether you're talking about state government or federal government, I think the government has been slower to recognize these risks. I think the insurance providers, right, have a direct financial incentive to pay attention to this issue. And I think what we've seen based on the data that made available to us is that essentially, cyber insurance providers, frankly, have taken a bath, right? They've lost. We saw one report that they're losing $4 for every $1 policy they write. Mm-hmm. Obviously, not sustainable, right? So we've actually seen insurance providers get out of that business, right. And the ones that have stayed in it, like you suggest, are now requiring school districts to implement all sorts of controls before they will even write a policy, or at least write a policy at preferred rates. And for everybody, no matter what, those rates are going up, right? So it used to be, it's a couple $1,000s for the cyber insurance policy. We don't have to worry about security because we have an insurance that'll help us. Well, that was the case, but it is no longer the case because those insurance companies can't make a business doing that. And, they're really leaning on school districts to improve their practices. It's fascinating to see that is the leverage point that is really pushing schools probably the hardest right now.
I'd agree with that. That really is one that's pushing hard on us. Yeah.
So that's kind of becoming the standard bearer as the insurance. That is interesting. But speaking of standards, Doug, I know the K-12 Cybersecurity Resource Center recently came out with the first of a series of standards and recommendations. Maybe we could kind of go through a couple of those for our audience who, while, as you said, maybe, they have a basic level of security and they're just kind of keeping their fingers crossed. And as you said, that's not enough anymore. So walk us through those.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this question of how do you help small and medium school districts, particularly those that don't have a lot of expertise? How do you help them get up to speed? We're really big believers in thinking about baseline protections, protections that every school district of any type can put into place. And maybe they're not going to protect about 100% of the risk, but maybe they're going to protect 70 or 80% of the risk. The things that are happening to virtually every school district many days, right? And so what we wanted to do is identify a short list, a dozen technical controls, mostly technical controls, that school districts can put in place that were sort of pragmatic, actionable, and cost effective. Not all free, some of them are free, right? And they're really in 4 categories. The first is just around protecting that network traffic going to and from district servers and district devices. Looking out for malware. We talked about the challenge of phishing, right? And you can address that both technically and through training and awareness. Blocking malicious documents, particularly macro-enabled Office documents. There was actually reporting just today that the Emotet malware is back in circulation. Emotet actually hit schools particularly hard, and its primary delivery vehicle was through macro-enabled Word documents. So you would see things like, here's our invoice, you need to pay it right away. Somebody clicks open the document, macros are enabled, Bob's your uncle, they're in your system. Right. And that's how that worked, particularly virulent stuff. As well, then finally, of sort of limiting the exposed services you have to the internet, right? So when you're running any kind of network, there's all sorts of services on a whole variety of ports that are sort of exposed by default to the internet. Remote desktop protocol is one that the FBI actually called out specifically with respect to school districts, which is a tool that actually helps provide remote support to users. Could be really valuable during remote learning times during COVID, but nonetheless, if those are exposed to the internet, bad actors are getting in, right? Really focused on end user devices, right? Making sure that end users don't have administrative rights to those devices to install, any software they want. It'll certainly limit the ability of threat actors to pivot within environments if they're able to compromise a device. Of course, devices need endpoint protection as well. The third is really what Mike has been talking about and talked about quite a bit, which is around user authentication, logins and passwords. We're a big believer in multi-factor authentication for staff, right? And then even within staff, there are more important groups than other groups as you start to roll it out. And then there's a set of sort of general IT maintenance tasks that we think are super important. Things like installing your security updates, making sure you have robust backups that are immutable and offline. So if you do get compromised, you can restore your systems. And then things just like making sure that you're actually archiving and deleting sensitive data from your systems as you can, right? So it's one thing to get compromised and have current student and staff data at risk. It's another thing if by getting compromised, you're actually exposing the last 5 or 10 or even 20 years of students and staff to that risk. And we've seen that happen in a number of school districts. And so, obviously school districts need to abide by records retention laws, but that doesn't mean that all of that data has to be available to everyone in the live system. And the degree to which we can expect there to be issues, right? We want to minimize that footprint where we might have a problem and minimize the risk if something does get exposed. Yeah. So that's really what our controls are about. We've written detailed standards around them. We've got a self-assessment tool as well, so districts can see how they measure up to those standards. I'll drop a link in, to that work. It's freely available for folks. And it was actually developed by our members, by K-12 IT practitioners for K-12 IT practitioners. And we've aligned that work to existing cybersecurity risk management frameworks for those who are more advanced, like the NIST CSF or the CIS controls, because there's a great body of best practices work that's been done that we're just building on top of and really helping to translate for the K-12 sector. Yeah. So no problem, Mike, right? You can get most of that stuff done by lunch.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about, from a real world perspective. I mean, how are you prioritizing things like that?
Well, the first one we've talked a lot about was training is getting a lot of attention, but multi-factor authentication, obviously some type of that is going on. Obviously, I think that deserves a lot of attention right now. And again, those are things from a user perspective we're doing. We're doing things on the network right now, shoring up current security you already have, making it better, in different ways. I'm just deciding how I want to share this, but I would say really making sure our organization, one thing I guess I'll step back on is making sure our organization, though, has the proper best practices in place. And Doug had alluded to the things that are really no cost, making sure your backups are, air gap, they're offline, they're away from the system, making sure that all your updates and your patches are in place on all your servers, on your endpoint devices. Those are things you just do. And if you're doing that, you're doing a lot to secure your system by making sure you stay on top of those things and being rigorous about doing so. Other things is having disaster recovery plans, planning for the worst, doing tabletop exercises. There's things like that. You plan that way and hope that you never have to use it, but working and refining those, making them better, having meetings about those. Again, more time type things, that you can do that are not a cost to the organization, but ultimately can help save you a lot in the long run, if something were to happen inside. Yeah. So
now I know the most difficult part of my job this afternoon was to end the conversation as we get here to the top of the hour. There's so much more that we could talk about, but I'd like to kind of leave with just a general question to each of you. When we have these conversations of cybersecurity, there's a lot of scary stuff, right? There's a lot of doom and gloom. But when I hear about the solutions that you're talking about, there is kind of a glass half full situation here, right? Maybe I'm biasing your answers right now, but I would love to end on the glass half full. Doug, talk a little bit about. This is an ongoing fight, but one that districts can come out on top, right?
Yeah. Look, 3 or 4 years ago, this was not a conversation that was happening in the K-12 community. I think, research by COSIN and just sort of, talking to district IT folks around the country, this is an issue that's top of mind for them. I think we're starting to see state and federal policymakers understand that this is an issue right now as well. You've got new organizations like mine that are here to help and to start to try to foster these conversations in trusted ways, right? Because I think what people have realized is this is not something that is just happening to their school district, right? Or some personal failing of you as an IT leader in your school district that you can't figure this stuff out. I mean, these are really big issues. They are affecting everybody. And I think we're starting to see people come together and look for solutions. So unfortunately, I think like Mike suggested, sometimes you need some people to have some pretty spectacular incidents to get people's attention. Unfortunately, those things have been happening, but I think we're starting to turn the corner in trying to put together, imagine and build a future where this is not something that is as challenging for school districts as it is right now.
Yeah. And Mike, we'll leave you with the last word on that.
I mean, I think the hope is that there are a lot of things that can be done that are at minimal cost or at no cost and are really just a time and effort thing. And we kind of, just to go back a minute, making sure everything is patched and updated, making sure putting in multi-factor authentication in place, which might have a minor cost associated with it, but there's some ways to make that pretty cheap, doing training for your staff. So there's lots of things like that if you don't have the funding available, but still helps reduce that risk. It's a risk. We go out every day. When we step outside the door, there's a risk involved. But do the things you can do with the money you have, and it'll take you quite a bit down that road to help your environment be a more secure environment. So obviously, as you get money to put that towards some of the sophisticated solutions that can help mitigate those things, but there are things we can do in the human capacity, I think, that are available to us. And then reach out to the vendors that you have, because they're always more than willing to help. I've always found that they want to help. They want to make sure they're doing everything they can. So there's lots of things you can do without the money if you don't have it.
Yeah, I certainly concur when you talk about one of the positive changes as a result of COVID is the industry response to schools. I think there's a renewed relationship between industry and the users and the districts, and especially when it comes to cybersecurity. So ultimately, I think that'll be a net positive that comes out of our current situation. But I see their time is about up, so I'm going to wrap up this conversation. If you submitted a question that we didn't get to, someone from Microsoft will follow up with you shortly. I'd really like to thank our presenters today for a really informative presentation. And I'd like to thank all the audience members for joining us as well. As a reminder, you'll get an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again for participating and have a great day. Doug, Mike, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.